Hello, my name is Neda Ghafarzadeh. I would like have a lecture and have a presentation about the lecture of students from University of California, Riverside, which made as November 2021 about DNS cache poisoning attack. As you can see, this research published at 2021 November. As I wrote the name and information of 3 students that who did this research. In the abstract, uh, explained that DNS is one of fundamental and ancient protocols on the internet, but DNS implemented with no security, as a result of which subject to a variety of serious attacks. One of the well-known attacks on DNS is DNS cache poisoning attack. And scientists made a solution. Basic solution is randomization, but still is subject to clever network side channel attacks. Side channel attacks cover not only Linux, but also a wide range of DNS software, including BIND, Unbound, and DNS masks. And also open resolvers are vulnerable about this attack, such as OpenDNS and Quad9. For the introduction, they explained DNS. DNS is domain name system, one of the most important infrastructure of modern internet. It translates the human-readable domain names into machine-readable IP addresses. Users of DNS nowadays are email authentication, routing security, and certificate issuance. Besides other users, home users, and companies. Effect of compromising. So effects of compromising this DNS is wide with a catastrophic range of consequences. But DNS has weak security design. There are several DNS security solutions which are not completely deployed, such DNS sec and DNS cookie, because of backward compatibility. DNS poisoning attack means an off-path attacker to poison a DNS cache with a malicious record to map a domain to an arbitrary IP address found in 1997. And after that, researchers and Dan Kaminsky identify a way to bypass the standard bailiwick checks in 2008. And a side channel based DNS cache poisoning attack dubbed SAT DNS was deployed that can effectively randomize the ephemeral port in a DNS query in 2019. SAT DNS is a new variant of DNS cache poisoning that allows an attacker to inject malicious DNS record into a DNS cache, thus redirecting any traffic to their own server and becoming a man-in-the-middle attack. A successful SAT DNS attack includes interaction among 3 different layers, such as ICMP, UDP, and application. Now you see affected softwares like BIND, Unbound, and DNS mask. Open resolvers include 13.85% of all. I use the name of researchers for these students that made this research. And they did a successful attack, which is end-to-end attack on the latest BIND resolver and a home internet, and find that it is reliable and takes only minutes to succeed. And for mitigation, researchers found setting proper socket options, randomizing the caching structure, rejecting specific ICMP messages. In this attack, attacker used a UDP ephemeral ports and ICMP messages. UDP ephemeral ports has two types, like public facing and private facing. Attacker with a scan can gain information about ephemeral ports, ephemeral UDP ports. Public-facing ephemeral ports are easier to scan when client use send to with a specific remote IP as an argument, and client OS accept packets from any IP addresses in ephemeral port with public facing UDP ephemeral port. Private facing ports, which means when client use connect argument and client OS accept packet from connected remote IP addresses. DNS cache poisoning attacks widely use ICMP messages, and ICMP is a diagnostic protocol used to signal error during the delivery of IP packets based on RFC 792. ICMP messages, one of the ICMP messages is TTL expired error, when which means time to leave. When a packet go through more than 4 T's hop, packet will drop. And ICMP distinguish which packets have encountered errors. A partial copy of the packet is embedded in the ICMP message, like source IP and port, and destination IP and port, in which attacker can use them. ICMP message types that have interesting interaction with UDP, like fragment needed, redirect, host port unreachable. In this lecture, researchers explain threat model and workflow in DNS cache poisoning. Which explained DNS hierarchy and attack targets. We have stop resolver, DNS forwarders, resolver, and name server. Stop resolver is a client and has cache to save time and to speed up. DNS forwarders are also caching proxies, perform the real name resolution taskbar, recursively consulting the name servers where the actual DNS records are stored. Resolvers are usually operated by ISPs or tech companies. In the picture, we can see the traffic flow between a stop resolver and authoritative name server. We have two assumptions. An attacker needs two main capabilities to launch the attack. One, the ability to trigger one or more queries from the target DNS server, forwarder, or resolver, which is sophisticated if the DNS resolver forwarder are in private networks because we don't have access to their IP address. And second, the ability to send packets with spoofed IP addresses. About the workflow of attack, the first step of the attack is to turn the resolver into a state where it is willing to accept responses from the name server. Attacker is off path, outside of the line. This can be achieved by simply sending a query to the resolver. After that, the attacker tries to forge a response packet and send it back to the victim resolver to poison the cache. DNS resolver check rogue response before accepting. The source IP of the response should be the name server, and DNS resolver check domain name and the 16-bit destination port number in the response, and the 16-bit transaction ID in the DNS payload. For the summary, we have 6 steps workflow. 1. Identify the victim resolver, the domain to poison and its name server. 2. Slow down name servers and prevent them from responding to the victim resolver. This gives the attacker more time. 3. Start triggering the query on the resolver. 4. Infer the ephemeral port of the query using our new side channels. 5. Once the port is known, inject 65,536 rogue responses with different TX IDs to the victim resolver by spoofing the name server's IP. 6. Check if the cache is poisoned. If not, go back to 3. Again, start triggering the query on the resolver. In this lecture, researchers explained about ICMP, which attacker can scan ephemeral ports. In prior methods of UDP-based port scan, UDP probes are used to determine whether a UDP port specified as the destination port number in the probe is open or closed. As you can see in the picture, attackers send UDP port to the victim server, which listen on several ports. If the port is open, ICMP. If the port is closed, ICMP unreachable message back to the attacker. This can also be used to discover public-facing ephemeral ports. To scan private-facing ephemeral ports, UDP probes must be sent using the source IP address of the remote peer. In ICMP-based port scan, an ICMP message embeds the header of the original packet from the source, including the source and destination port information. Researchers observed that they told an important note, which is we observed that an attacker does not necessarily have to rely on the explicit feedback from an ICMP probe. Instead, even if the processing of ICMP probes is completely silent, as long as there is some shared resource whose state is influenced, we may find ways, other probe, to observe the changed state of the shared resource. 2 types of ICMP which are useful for port scan are ICMP fragment needed, or ICMP packet too large big in ICMP IPv6 and ICMP redirect. Handling ICMP error message in OS occurred in the way that OS invoke UDP4lib error argument to handle the error when receives an ICMP version 4 message with an embedded UDP packet. OS check for tuple in UDP packet source destination IP port with UDP4 lib lookup argument. If it passes the check, the ICMP error will be handled according to the type of error. Handling ICMP fragment needed and redirect done in the way that two kernel functions should be revoked, IPv4 SK redirect argument and IPv4 SK update PMTU, and OS make changes in the routing table called the next hop exception, FNHE, or exception cache. The issue of ICMP fragment needed is OS does not check the source IP address of the ICMP fragment needed messages, so attacker can use spoofed IP addresses. For extract public facing port number with ICMP fragment needed, all we need to do is to send an ICMP fragment needed message with the attacker's own IP address. The message embeds a UDP header with a suggested source port and destination port of 53. It is also supposed to contain the source and destination IP addresses, which should be resolver's IP and name server's IP respectively. Popular DNS softwares produce public-facing ephemeral ports, so accept any inner destination IP address in an ICMP message as long as the inner source address matches the resolver's IP and inner source port matches the ephemeral port. This means one can easily trick the resolver to update the MTUs for any remote IPs. For extracting private-facing port number, most DNS software like example BIND will produce private-facing ephemeral ports. First, set the inner destination IP address to the IP address of the name server. UDP4lib lookup argument will check the complete port tuple of the embedded UDP packet to locate the socket that has previously been connected. Second, the exception cache state changes private to the name server and not directly observable by attacker. For example, even if the MTU for the name server is reduced and off, path attacker cannot directly observe because fragments will go toward the name server directly. In this picture, we see fragment needed based public port inference, redirect based public port inference, and fragment needed based private port inference. As you can see in fragment needed based private port inference, attacker of path attacker need more challenge to inference private facing port numbers. Another subject in attack is finding IPs that cause hash collisions. Finding a single IP address that collides within the same IP ID bucket as the victim should own 10,000 IPs would bring the colliding rate to an arbitrary IP over a 2048 entry hash table to more than 98%, which is not effective to DNS cache poisoning attack. In this research, researcher choose to insert the secret used in the keyed hash function that computes the index into the 2048 buckets. And they know first the hash function is public, listed in the kernel source code. The secret is only 32 bits and persists until reboots. If crack it once and use it to check which IP is collided with a given name server's IP. And they also tested the same methodology with IPv6 because an IPv6 hash bucket has only 5 slots instead of 6. And in the attacks, high-speed scans is important. For either public-facing or private-facing ports, an attacker can probe multiple source ports to learn if any of the guesses match the correct ephemeral port. There are two strategies for a scan. One, batch scan, and second, single packet scan. In batch scan, we can probe many ports at once and check whether any of them has hit the correct port. In a single packet scan only a single port in each batch, which is suboptimal as the attack is highly time sensitive. We favor fewer round trips over higher bandwidth consumption. So they use batch scan. For making vulnerable population, researchers explain conditions of successful attacks. One key necessary condition for a resolver to be considered exploitable is must check the port number in the embedded UDP packet of an ICMP error before processing it, which done in OS, satisfied in all recent kernel versions. Second, must cache the MTU or next hop information, which is done in OS again. And the Linux kernel since 3.6 is vulnerable in IPv4. Third, must not ignore the ICMP fragment needed for ICMP redirect messages in kernel, which is done in both app and OS. Fourth, must not shut down or retransmit the query after receiving ICMP messages, which is done in both app and OS. The version of OS or app you can see here are exploitable. For the summary, for the latest versions of BIND and Unbound on the latest kernels, their IPv6 sockets can be exploited for the ephemeral port scan. DNS mask is always vulnerable as it does not set any special socket option. In the table, you can see the details that shows kernel versions and DNS software versions and number of and version of IP, which are 4 and 6, and condition 1 and 2, 4 that software version and kernel version are vulnerable against them. In the other operating system, FreeBSD, it is not vulnerable. In Windows 2019, the built-in Microsoft DNS server uses public-facing ports, which makes it vulnerable. For attacks on open resolvers, they use ICMP fragment needed messages only. This is because ICMP redirect-based attacks require IP spoofing even for port scans. And so for doing attacks, they needed such a large scale IP spoofing experiment. For setup and dataset, first obtain a list of open resolvers from census.io. The number of open resolvers are 1.84 million IPv4. No IPv6 open resolvers addresses are used. Second, design a method to solicit queries from IPv6 backend servers. The methodology is when a backend server, either IPv6 or IPv4, contacts our name server, researchers will perform the following 4 tests that approximately correspond to the 4 conditions. 1. T1, the rejection of the ICMP error when embedded source port is incorrect. T2, the existence of the next hop exception cache. T3, the acceptance of the ICMP error. T4, the open port status after receiving the ICMP error. In the results, out of the 1,056,107 backend resolver IPs that reach out name servers, 13.85% of them are estimated to be vulnerable. Excuse me, I corrected 1,500 approximately backend resolvers IP addresses. If we count by front-end resolver IPs, out of the 1.84 million, 37.72% are estimated vulnerable. From 13.85% vulnerable population in the backend, they find that 13,000 approximately are clearly vulnerable to public-facing port scans. The results indicate that the majority of the vulnerable population is not actually running BIND. This table shows vulnerable status of public resolvers, Google Cloudflare Open DNS, front-end IP, and which situation is committed in attack T1 to T4. There are some practical concerns, some practical considerations which will influence the success and reliability of the attack. One, small attack window. Next, multiple name servers, multiple backend servers, dual stack resolvers, noises such as background traffic, packet losses, and packet reordering. For the evaluation, evaluate the efficiency of attack. Researchers attacks without causing real-world damage, and overall, the attacks can succeed in minutes and have a near-perfect success rate. The table shows resolver attack results, parameters loss, RTT, NS, and batch, packet loss in them, RTT range, and average time and succeed rate. As you can see, most of the attacks success rate is 20 from 20. In discussion, comparison with SAT DNS, existing defenses, responsible disclosure. The first and most difference is the use of ICMP props in their attack with SAT DNS. Second, in this attack, side channel leveraged the space resource limit, while SAT DNS side channel leverages the time resource limit. Second, in practice and theoretically, ICMP based ephemeral port scan rate can be unlimited, but in the SAT DNS only allows the fixed 1000 PPS slow port scan. Third, unlike the global counter used in SAT DNS, which is shared across all remote IPs, the exception cache used in the side channel attack researcher used is a hash-based structure and is only shared with a small range of IPs, which reduce the noise level of the side channel attack that they use. In the end, compared to SAT DNS, this attack requires an additional step of inferring colliding IPs that hash into the same bucket. Additionally, enabling path MTU discovery on DNS packets is a solution for fragmentation-based DNS cache poisoning attacks. So BIND and Unbound start to set the socket option of IP PMTU disk underline omit, which instruct the kernel to never reduce the MTU for IPv4 only. In IPv6, fragmentation can be avoided most of the time at the minimum MTU is increased to 1218. There are already several additional DNS security solutions which are not widely deployed, such as DNSSEC 0x20 encoding DNS cookie. New defenses against DNS cache poisoning attack are set proper socket option, randomize the caching structure, reject ICMP redirect. In conclusion, this paper presents novel side channels during the process of handling ICMP errors, a previously overlooked attack surface. Researchers find that side channels can be exploited to perform high-speed off-path UDP ephemeral port scans. By leveraging this, the attacker could effectively poison the cache of a DNS server in minutes. They show that side channels affect many open resolvers and thus have serious impacts. Finally, this research presents mitigations against the discovered side channels. And the end.